How are you doing today? Great to have you all here at the North Carolina Botanical Garden and our folks on Zoom as well. Well, I'm Joanna Lalikas. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Garden, and we're excited to have one of our own with us today for this Lunchbox talk. Emma York Marzolf joined our conservation department at the North Carolina Botanical Garden in 2019. And she was hired to help kickstart the Native Plant Materials Development Program. And that's a bit of a mouthful, so she's here to share more detail about what that is today. She has a bachelor's degree in biology from Piedmont University, and that's in Georgia, and a master's degree in environmental studies, conservation and management from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And between earning her degrees, Emma worked in plant ecology research and conservation, both for the Georgia Department of Natural Resources and the Jones Center in Itchaway in Southwest Georgia. So, Emma, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to hear what you have to tell us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joanna and David, for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you all that are here and then also online. So welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about increasing seeds for conservation needs. First, I just want to get a quick little overview of what I'm going to present to you all. So first, we'll go over why we should be using native seed in restoration and rehabilitation of degraded lands, the challenges of access to native seed. Then I'll talk about that very jargony term, native plant materials development, and what exactly that means. And then finally, I'll get to the fun part and we'll talk about what's happening here at the garden to address the challenge. So why native seed? First off, before I talk about why, I want to go ahead and define what is native seed. So this definition has a couple of layers. And so that first being that native seed is indigenous to an area that was and not intentionally or unintentionally introduced by humans. And so I'm specifically referring to before the arrival of Europeans. And so this really is a broad umbrella of covering North America. So we can focus that down even further and talk about native seed on a local regional level. So what I mean is that what is native to Colorado is not what is native here in North Carolina. So this is where the term local ecotype becomes really important. So a local ecotype is a subset of species that is adapted to the environmental conditions and the biological conditions of a particular geographic location and is genetically distinct from said groups of that same species found in a different location. So for example, woodland coreopsis is found throughout the Southeast, but woodland coreopsis growing in Mississippi is genetically distinct from woodland coreopsis growing here in the Piedmont of North Carolina. So now that I've told you what makes a native plant native and the definition of a local ecotype, what's the benefit of using local ecotypes? So local ecotypes are more closely adapted to the conditions of the restoration site. And so conditions like soil and climate. And also local ecotypes have co-evolved with the pollinators and the other fauna in that area that use those plants for survival. So the challenge, so restoration practitioners and native seed users, whether that be federal, state, tribal, or private sector use, have often expressed the lack of available native seed, and specifically seed that is appropriate for their projects, meaning those local ecotypes that we talked about are not available. So in 2018, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank and the University of Maryland Extension conducted a survey of native plant users and seed users in the Eastern United States, and 74% of those expressed a preference for those local ecotypes, but they identified that commercial availability, was their greatest barrier to using those ecotypes. And so that means that they're often using substitutions that are not native or not adapted to their site conditions, really because they have no other choice right now. And so that often leads to project failure. And so when I'm talking about failure, I just mean that maybe the plants don't survive, or in some cases, those non-natives can become invasive. And so the other issue is that even if a practitioner can find those local ecotypes, they're really limited on the species diversity. So meaning that seed producers only have a handful of species available, but natural communities, as we know, have tens of hundreds of species in some cases. So in order to restore the lands back to as close as we can possibly get to its original state, knowing that it's never going to be what it used to be, but we should be putting as many species as possible in these areas that we've degraded. And so that's really our responsibility. This challenge has been known for many, many years, but is most recently reflected in a final report that came out this year from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And so one of the recommendations that they made was to address this challenge, this problem, through native plant materials development. And so I've talked about what the native portion of this term means. So the plant materials, part of that is really any portion of a plant that can be propagated, including seed, cuttings, or the whole plant. So the development portion just means that it really involves many different steps, including acquiring seed from the wild, research on things like germination requirements, how to grow species in farm production, harvest methods, cleaning methods, and then taking that knowledge and passing it on to growers that have the ability to produce on a large scale. And so finally, another portion of that is having a place to store those seeds and those storage facilities with the right conditions. So these being short-term holding facilities, but also seed banks, which are intended for preserving seed for longer periods of time. And so there are a lot of programs across the country that are currently doing this work. And some of those are involved in every stage of plant materials development, or some of them may just be involved in a couple of stages. And so just to give you a couple of examples, the Southwest Seed Partnership is working in Arizona and New Mexico, and they do a lot of wild collection. The Northwest Plant Materials Program, they're involved in research, wild collections, grow out. And these two programs are managed by the Institute of Applied Ecology in Oregon. A few others are the Iowa Tallgrass Prairie Center, Texas Native Seed Program, and then also the Arkansas Native Seed Program. So these are just a few of the many, many programs across the US. And I can't list them all here, but I just wanted to take a second and acknowledge that what we're doing here, the garden isn't a novel idea, but is a lot more work to be done here, specifically in the Southeast. So this effort has to be a regional effort since, like I stated, we need regional seed. And so just to give you a little background in the seedy history of the North Carolina Botanical Garden, the conservation department at the garden has worked with seeds for a long time, including seed banking for the Center for Plant Conservation since 1984. So the Center for Plant Conservation is a network of conservationists that collaborate to protect imperiled plant species. And we have also partnered with the Seeds of Success program, as well as the Millennium Seed Bank to preserve seeds of common species. And so the Seeds of Success program is a national seed collection program led by the Bureau of Land Management. And that program started in 2001. And then the Millennium Seed Bank is managed by Kew Gardens in the UK, and they preserve billions of seeds from all over the world for future use. So we continue to be a partner with these programs, but we aren't currently actively making collections for them. But Because of all this past experience, a lot of that experience, or some of that experience before I was even born, and knowing there is a need for native plants in restoration, as Joanna mentioned, in 2019, the garden started the Native Plant Materials Development Program, and I was hired as a conservation grower at that point. I just want to take a second to also point out that this doesn't include the work that the horticulture department has done and continues to be involved with, like our garden shop seed packets, Wildflower of the Year program, and the membership seed benefit. And so the horticulture department has been distributing seeds to the public since 1978. So from here, I want to transition to what we're doing here at the garden in the Native Plant Materials program. So the program has 4 different goals. The first goal being wild collection. So we want to collect seed from all 4 ecoregions of North Carolina. Our second goal is seed increase. And so the intention for seed increase is to provide seed for restoration and also to act as a trial garden. And then we also, our third goal is to partner with other growers. So we want to help seed farmers and native plant growers diversify their species catalog. And then our fourth goal is simply plug production. And so we want to be able to supply practitioners in North Carolina with whole plants. So one really important component to consider before we move on to talk about wild collections is genetic diversity. And so compared to using low diversity material, genetically diverse plant material can improve establishment under a range of conditions. It increases resistance to pests and pathogens, and then also support faster recovery after disturbance. And so there are ways that we can ensure that our collections are genetically diverse. And one of those is to identify seed sources with conditions similar to potential restoration sites. So there are decades of research that show that plant populations are adapted to the environmental and biological conditions where they grow, like soil type, temperature, the pests, things like that. And then you also want to collect from sites with very large populations. So we, when we do wild collections, we target populations that have hundreds of reproductive individuals. And then we collect from the individuals across the area. So you don't want to just like focus in one little corner and only collect from those plants. You want to move throughout the area while you collect. And you only want to collect from a small percentage of the population. And so some of the types of species that we target for wild collections are common species, species that can tolerate a range of conditions. They're beneficial to pollinators, and then ones that aren't currently in the commercial seed trade. Types of sites that we that we visit. As I mentioned, we've focused on collecting from all four ecoregions of North Carolina, so that's the mountains, Piedmont, Sandhills, and the coastal plain. We often find ourselves on a lot of roadsides and right-of-ways because those tend to be some of the last open areas where a lot of our target species are easily found, especially here in the Piedmont. So we also collect in national forests and state game lands, and just as a warning, I don't know if it's really a warning, but we always collect appropriate permission. So make sure that you have permission from the landowner before you do any sort of collecting. So next, I just want to go over what that process looks like when we make seed collections. So one of the first things that we do, we like to call scouting. And this is the first step. And so in this step, we're looking for potential locations to make collections. So we use iNaturalist. We use herbarium records, and sometimes just good old word of mouth. So if you're familiar with iNaturalist, and unfortunately the picture of the screenshot I took was a little cut off, but if you're familiar, we have a project on the website called the North Carolina Native Plant Materials Development. And so we use that to keep track of the plants that we encounter on our scouting trips, but also to find potential collection sites. So for instance, you can search for a species within the app, and it will bring up all the locations where other users have made observations of that species. And sometimes we have to be a little bit cautious when using it. Sometimes folks will post plants in there just from their garden. And those aren't necessarily what we're looking for. And so we use a somewhat similar approach with the herbarium records, but we have a little more confidence in the identification of the plant. But the downside, or one of the downsides of using herbarium records, is that a lot of them are older. Some of them, even from 2010, that plant may not be there any longer. It'd be a parking lot at this point. And so that's really the benefit of using iNaturalist, is that it's more up to date and almost in real time. And so we try to make an initial visit when we expect that the species that we're looking for are going to be flowering. And so at that point, we collect a voucher specimen. We press that. And so that specimen becomes forever associated with any seed collection that we make at that location. So it's very valuable and extremely important to have those physical vouchers, because if anyone who purchases our seeds or uses our seeds has any sort of question about the identification, we can go back and look at that voucher, and those all get sent up to the herbarium on campus. And then we go back when we think the seed is mature, and we make collections. Sometimes it looks a little bit like seed shopping. And so we're always aiming to collect from, like I said, hundreds of individuals. In some cases, a bare minimum of 50. So our goal is to at least get 10,000 seeds in a collection. And sometimes that's really easy to hit that number, because some individual plants can produce hundreds of seeds. But some only produce a couple of seeds per plant. And so those collections can be very time consuming, but others are really easy. You can just walk through a population. Species like grasses are easy to just strip the seed off. And then we're also filling out data sheets, because it's really important to know where you've been and what the habitat looked like and what other species in that particular area. We're also recording GPS location, soil type information, things like that. And then we eventually make it back to the garden with a bunch of little paper bags, a bunch of little cloth bags. And so we lay everything out, let everything dry out, because we don't want anything to mold. And so then we have to reduce these collections down to just the seeds. So a lot of times when you're collecting, you're clipping seed heads and just tossing those in a bag. And so it's important to just get those down to the seeds, so removing things like debris, leaves, any non-seed thing. And so we have a couple of different pieces of equipment that we can use, like sieves, and then a blower. This what's in that third photo there. Might be a little bit difficult to see it, but essentially the seed just falls out the bottom, and all of the dust and debris goes out the top. We also use those yellow. You can see those yellow buckets in that picture. Sometimes you can put seed, like species that have seed pods or seed heads that really hold on to the seed. And you can put it inside that bucket, you can roll up the end of the bucket, and you just whack it against a table, whack it against a counter, and it just releases all of that seed and falls into the bucket. And so we also, for really big batches of cleaning, we have a giant yellow bag. They hang from the ceiling, and then we take a tennis racket and we just hit it over and over until a seed falls out. And so it's really sophisticated work. It's very technical, but if nothing else, it's a productive way to get out some frustration. So that's the cleaning and storage. I just want to take a nice little second to acknowledge our plant conservation technicians that we've had over the past 3.5 years. So we usually hire 2 technicians for the summer. Those are 6-month positions. And without them, this wouldn't be really possible. And so they so far have made 626 collections representing all ecoregions of North Carolina and 245 different species. And so this is just a little heat map here of all the places that we've been. As you can see, it's very hot there in the triangle. That's really due to the first year of this program. And then also in 2020, when we couldn't travel and go anywhere. So we were just on a lot of roadsides in the triangle collecting seed. Okay, so the next section is on our second goal of seed increase. And so these are single species plots that we harvest bulk seed from. And we also use this space as a trial garden for new species. So we want to be able to try new species and learn what the requirements are for germination, how they respond in a monoculture setting, harvest timing, and methods. So then we can pass that knowledge on to other growers. And so we're currently, our growing space is about 1/4 of an acre. Rows on average are between 50 and 100 feet long. And we currently have 30 species of Piedmont and Sandhills ecotypes. I want to mention that I have a lovely group of volunteers. A couple of them are here today, thank you. That spend most of the spring and summer weeding at the farm. So kudos to them for coming back each week when it's hot and sweaty. And then they also help out with seed harvest and cleaning in the fall and winter. Our technicians also spend time at the farm weeding and then also seed collecting when they aren't out making those lovely wild collections. Okay, so here are just some of the species that we have out in our seed increase. So the pollinators absolutely love the mountain mint. They go wild over it, and the butterfly weed. I intentionally planted species for a couple of reasons that flower at different times of the year. One of those reasons is because for restoration, you want a variety of flowering times, but also so making harvest a little bit easier if you're not trying to harvest everything all at one time. But it's really nice to spend your time, your work day out there when everything is progressing through the year and there's always something new flowering. And then we also have a few more out there. So the Piedmont Barber's buttons is usually the first one to flower. And it's really one of my favorites. But I also really love this lovely little legume, the twining snout bean. Those little yellow flowers are just adorable. And so as you can see, I like to take a lot of photos of bumblebees, and that's because they're a lot slower than some of the other insects that are out there. That's more of a me problem. But the rattlesnake master is just a magnet for wasps. There's all kinds of different wasps that are on it, and it's just fantastic. So you definitely have to be comfortable being around flying insects, but we just work in harmony out there. It's a lot of fun, no negative encounters so far. So harvest timing is one of the trickier aspects of seed farming. And so that's because most species don't flower all at once, go to seed all at once at the same time, and then you harvest it all at the same time. So as you can see in this photo, hopefully you can see in the top left corner, this is that snout bean plant that I just love so much. But as you can see, there's a little fruit on there that's ripe, that's sort of brown. And then there's still some unripe fruit. And this one individual plant is still even flowering on there. So you have to go back week after week and check these species, harvest, come back the next week, harvest some more. So it can be a little bit time consuming. In theory, I could just wait until everyone's done flowering, everyone's done seeding, and just collect it all at once. But that's really lowering your genetic diversity. So you're gonna miss those seeds that are ripe earlier in the year. And so we do our best. Sometimes we miss seeds. It's never going to be perfect, but we do a lot of hand harvesting just because our plots are fairly small compared to, you know, a real large scale production. But then we also used a little shop vac there in that far picture. You can see we use that on asters and things that the seed fluffs out, and you're typically wind dispersed, we can use the vacuum just to go through and zoop, zoop, zoop. It's a lot of fun. And so at the end of the season, we end up with a room full of giant bags of seed and plant material from the farm, tiny little bags from wild collections. So just like I was mentioning with the wild collections, everything has to get cleaned and processed and stored. And so in 2021, we harvested about 24 pounds of seed. So that's pretty good for a quarter of an acre. I'm not sure how much we harvested this year. We haven't counted and processed everything yet. And then, so we make this seed available to conservation and restoration practitioners. So, so far we've sold seed to the Nature Conservancy. We're also working with Triangle Land Conservancy to get them some seed for one of their projects. So our third goal is to work with other growers. So we've started working with some other growers to get at that goal of diversifying the available species in the commercial market. So far we're working with Brownstone Native Seed in Kentucky, where they're growing about 25 different species of North Carolina ecotypes. We're also working with Mellow Marsh Farm. We've shared 6 species with them. The Rural Advancement Foundation International and the Farmers of Color Network. We've provided them with plugs with 2 different species for them to establish on farms for production that were originally other crops. Let me take a second. Water. This is a photo from the Roundstone native seed production. That's all smooth beard tongue. Is that the common name? Penstemon, beard tongue. So then our fourth and last goal is to supply conservation groups with plugs for their land rehabilitation and restoration projects. So usually this time of year, I'm putting seeds into trays. So I don't use a greenhouse. We have a shade house where we grow everything. We also have a sun pad that we move plants out onto once they're large enough to handle the full sun. And so since 2019, we've produced around 2,100 plugs and 70 different species for various projects. And just to give you an idea of the types of projects we worked on before we wrap up. Our pennies bin restoration. So some of you may, yes, Johnny. 21,000. Yes. Are you shocked, John? Oh, 21,000. Yes. Thank you. So some of you may be familiar with Penny's Bend Nature Preserve, but if not, this is a preserve located north of Durham along the Eno River that is managed by the garden. And so historically, much of the land was open meadow, but over the years, the non-native loblolly pines have encroached on those areas. So in 2020, a 30-acre about area was logged, removing the loblolly, and since then we've been working to put local ecotype plants back on the landscape. Thankfully, so we've received grant funding in 2021 from the Birds, Bees, Greater Good Foundation to grow 5,000 plugs to put back out on the landscape. And then also as a part of that grant allowed us to provide some of our local partners, including LOB Creek Watershed Association, Eno River Association, and the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program with 1,500 plugs to plant on the lands that they steward. Here are just a few of the species for that project. And then finally, one of the really first plug production projects that we did in 2019, we started working with North Carolina Sea Grant's Coastal Landscapes Initiative and the North Carolina Aquarium at Pine Knoll Shores to enhance habitat with seaside little bluestem, which is a host plant for a caterpillar of the crystal skipper butterfly. So this butterfly is endemic to a small area of the North Carolina coast. If you're familiar with the coast, its range is from Fort Macon to Bogue Banks. So the goal is to revegetate and enhance areas where skippers were known to be, but those areas had been recently damaged by a large storm event, recent storm events. And so we collected seed, 5 different species from Fort Macon State Park in fall of 2019. And then in 2020, we grew 1,000 plugs of seaside little bluestem and 500 plugs of other dune plants that were thought to possibly be really important for nectaring. This was a really fun project to work on, and I was able to grow some species that I'd never grown before, specifically prickly pear cactus, which was a bit of a challenge, but it turns out that if you grow something like prickly pear cactus, the folks that are doing the planting are not going to be super happy with you. And they actually ended up making me plant all of it. That was okay. I had gloves. We survived. So yeah, so that was one of the first projects. It was a lot of fun to do. And so that's what we've been doing so far the past 3.5 years. So this year we'll be growing plugs for Triangle Land Conservancy. And then also I'm working with Rural Advancement Foundation International and Farmers of Color, again, to get them some more species for production. And they're also looking to expand our seed increase and put some new species out there to harvest from. And so here are just a few of the resources that I use if anyone is interested in learning more about genetic diversity, some of the other programs I mentioned. And so thank you so much for your attention and your interest today. And I'll take any questions that we have.
Great talk. I'm curious, like how much of the species selection for your plug production is kind of driven by the end user, and like what's the timeline for that production to meet their needs?
So it kind of depends on the end user and who that is. But generally, when folks are coming to us asking for plugs, we kind of give a little bit of guidance on, we think that these would work great for you. A lot of people already sort of have an idea of what they want. And so these are all done on a contract basis. We don't really keep any inventory. And so when they come to us, we, say, these are the species that we have available. What's your wish list? Try to kind of help them narrow that down. And then what was the second part? Oh, the timeline. So it would be lovely if everyone came to us in maybe a year in advance, but that doesn't always happen. But typically folks will come to us either in the fall or early winter. And so I'll start growing those species, and a lot of them are ready to plant then towards the end of the summer, early fall. Some of them I like to give another year, but that's usually the typical timeline for that. Thank you.
From our virtual audience, you used the term growing at a large scale a couple of times. How would you define that? Does that include small farmers or large farmers, both, or other types of growers?
Yeah, so I guess what I was referring to are these very large, there I go again, farms that have acres and acres. I'm talking maybe 10 acres of just one species. And so there are a couple throughout the US. A lot of them are in the Midwest, but we really only have a few in the Southeast of growers that are growing on that scale. So that's what I'm talking about mostly.
So you have the target species criteria, but within that, do you have a prioritization of species that you're selecting that fit those target criteria? Or is it just opportunistic when you're out in the field and you're scouting, you might see something that fits that and you decide you're going to go for that?
So it's a little bit of both. So whenever we start thinking about our target list for that year. In the beginning, we were basing this a lot on something that the garden developed with some other groups called the North Carolina Pollinator Toolkit. And so that's just a list of really beneficial pollinator plants throughout the state. But from there, we have also done market research to see what other, like these large scale growers don't have available. And so we're not out looking for things that they're already growing, because that's not super helpful. But then also, like you said, when we're out there collecting, sometimes it is opportunistic. Like you're not expecting to see a particular species there. That's not what you went there for, but it's also a good one and there's a lot of it. We'll just take that opportunity to also make a collection of that.
Well, for hands in the room, and David's got a couple of questions here he can ask while you're thinking.
And this might be for another person in the room, but are the seeds provided to members and sold in the shop local ecotypes? And what about the plants sold during the plant sales?
So Heather, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so all the seeds that are offered to the members through the member seed program and through the gift shop, through the seed packs, they are all local ecotype. They're all collected either here on site at the gardens or in the Triangle area. Yes. And the plant sale, pretty much the same, but Matt can answer that question.
Yeah, most of what we grow are locally collected seed that Heather has done or we have done. And occasionally we have the access to seeds that are within our region, but not necessarily within North Carolina. And that is for very specific species that might not have been collected here. So if we have access to it, we think it would be a good plant to grow, we will use this.
Thank you, Heather and Catherine.
I love
Oh,
this.
Heather's
I
gonna
love this
add to
group effort. This is great.
I also just wanted to add that on this year's member seed list, there are a few guest appearances that Emma has provided the seed. So we are actually, yeah, we collaborate, and Emma provides seed to the horticulture department and vice versa if there's anything that we have that they can use. So yeah.
Great, thank you. For those on Zoom, we are hearing from Heather Summer, and we're also hearing from Catherine Meehan, who are both in our horticulture department.
And I'd like to say that both Emma and Mike are very generous with seed for us as well. And so some of our seed come from them too. So it's a group effort.
Big team here at the garden. Go
Absolutely.
team.
Yeah.
Okay, another question, David, from Zoom.
Do you know where the Triangle Land Conservancy is using our plantings?
Yes, I believe their Brumley North Preserve is where they're actively doing restoration. Is that right, Mike? Yes.
Other questions in the room here? We do have more on Zoom. All right, David.
In your shade house, what percentage shade cloth are you using?
So it's a 60-40, so it's letting 60% of the sunlight through.
All right, another from Zoom. If you find unique or rare species, how do you protect those seed sources when posting to iNaturalist?
This is a good question. So if we happen to be in an area where we know that there are sensitive plants, protected plants, federally or state, we actually obscure any INAT observations that we make in that area just to avoid any potential issues down the road of folks with nefarious who could go out and potentially poach some of those rare plants. So we're usually not out looking for those rare species, but sometimes we are in those areas where we know they are, and we want to do our best to protect those. So anytime we're making observations and we're actually sharing those locations, they're all common species.
Right, any questions in the room? David, you're on again.
Got it. Couple more from Zoom. Back to the voucher specimens, can DNA samples be taken from those so that analysis can be done in the future to see if there's any significant changes in DNA over time from climate change or other sources?
Yes, sure. So it's a really good question. I didn't mention it here, but we have actually started this year making DNA voucher collections when we make the herbarium voucher collection. So we have that for, as the technology and the science progresses, we have those available.
Johnny?
Emma, what's the best way to store seeds short-term, like 1 to 5 years?
Sure. So here at the garden, we store all of these seeds in a room that is low humidity and low temperature. Typically, the lower the temperature and the lower the humidity of your space, the longer your seeds are going to be viable. Does that answer your question, Johnny? Yes. Okay.
Another from Zoom.
I'm gonna ask two unrelated questions at the same time because they're both yes and no questions.
Okay.
One, are you also growing any grass, sedge, or rust species? And second, do you do any tissue cultures for propagation?
So yes, we have a couple of grass species. This year is the first year that we've done collected any sedges, but I don't have any of those in production. And then, no, I haven't done any work with tissue culture.
These have been fantastic questions. Okay, well, Emma, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to hear more about your program, and thanks for taking time to share about it with our audience
Yeah.
today.
Thank you.